Over 5,000 years ago, along the banks of the mighty Indus River and its tributaries, a civilization emerged that would quietly reshape the ancient world. What began as small farming villages eventually transformed into a network of advanced urban centers, forming what we now call the Indus Valley Civilization. By around 2600 BCE, this civilization had entered its golden age. Cities like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, and Lothal stood as some of the most organized and meticulously planned settlements of their time. Streets were laid out in perfect grids. Multi-room brick houses lined the roads, each equipped with private wells, baths, and access to a sophisticated drainage system. Covered sewers ran beneath the streets, carrying wastewater out of the city, an urban feature unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. The people of the Indus Valley were skilled craftsmen, engineers, and traders. They used standardized weights and measures, suggesting a tightly organized economic system. Metalworkers shaped tools and ornaments from copper and bronze, while artisans made intricate pottery, jewelry, and figurines out of terracotta and semi-precious stones. Perhaps the most iconic artifacts of the Indus Valley are their carved seals, made of steatite, often depicting animals, human figures, and an undeciphered script. These seals were likely used for trade, identification, or administration. To this day, their script remains a mystery. No one has yet cracked the code of their writing. The Harappans were also remarkable traders. Goods from the Indus have been discovered in ancient Mesopotamia, and vice versa. The Mesopotamians referred to the Indus region as Meluha, a distant land of high-quality goods like lapis lazuli, ivory, and cotton textiles. Harappan merchants traded by both land and sea, linking the subcontinent to the wider ancient world. What's equally intriguing is what we don't find. No evidence of palaces, no temples, no monuments to kings or gods. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley shows little sign of a ruling class or warfare. This suggests a society based on cooperation, not conquest, order, not oppression. For centuries, the Indus Valley Civilization thrived quietly, its cities humming with life, its people living in cleanliness, order, and remarkable peace. It was a golden chapter in human history, brilliant, complex, and yet still deeply enigmatic. By around 1900 BCE, something began to change in the cities of the Indus Valley. The well-planned streets, the uniform architecture, the orderly life, all began to unravel. Archaeological layers show clear signs of decline. Streets once swept clean were now cluttered with debris. Houses were rebuilt without regard for earlier plans. Skilled craftsmanship gave way to cruder tools and pottery. The signature Harappan seals and standardized weights gradually disappeared. More tellingly, the writing system, once carved into thousands of seals and tablets, ceased to appear altogether. The script that had been such a distinctive part of Harappan identity simply vanished from the archaeological record. Large cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were slowly abandoned. There's no evidence of fire, war, or catastrophe, only a quiet depopulation. Populations moved east and south, toward smaller villages and rural settlements along the Ganges and the upper reaches of the Yamuna. The uniformity that once linked this vast civilization began to dissolve. Each region developed its own pottery styles, settlement patterns, and ways of life. The cultural fabric of the Indus was fraying. This was not the fall of an empire. It was the fading of a civilization, gradual, complex, and still not fully understood. To understand the decline of the Indus Valley Civilization, we must look beyond the ruins of its cities and examine the landscape itself, its rivers, its climate, and the powerful forces of nature that shaped the fate of its people. At the heart of this ancient civilization was water. Rivers like the Indus, the Ravi, and the now extinct Ghaggar nourished the land, sustained agriculture, and connected cities through trade. These rivers weren't just natural features, they were lifelines. But around 2200 BCE, things began to change. A major climatic event was unfolding, not just in the Indian subcontinent, but across the ancient world. The Indian summer monsoon, which had long brought life-giving rains to the Indus region, began to weaken. What followed was a long, slow drought. Evidence from lake sediments, pollen analysis, and isotope data confirms a significant drop in monsoon intensity over several centuries. Rainfall declined, crops failed, wells and reservoirs dried up. The once fertile floodplains turned arid. Farmers could no longer rely on predictable harvests. Food security, one of the cornerstones of urban stability, was under threat. And with failing crops came the need to migrate. Populations moved away from once thriving cities in search of more reliable water sources. Urban centers that had taken centuries to build began to empty. But drought was only one part of the puzzle. Equally devastating was the fate of the rivers themselves. One of the most critical rivers for the eastern Harappan settlements, the Ghaggar, began to vanish. For decades, this river has been identified by many scholars with the legendary Saraswati River mentioned in ancient Indian texts. But regardless of its name, the river's disappearance had real consequences. It's believed that tectonic activity in the region may have caused the Ghaggar-Hakra's main sources, the Sutlej and Yamuna rivers, to change course, diverting their waters away. Without regular flow, the river slowly dried up. Settlements along its banks lost access to water, irrigation collapsed, and agriculture became unsustainable. River course changes, triggered by earthquakes, sediment buildup, or natural erosion, can reshape entire civilizations. And in the case of the Indus Valley, it appears these geological shifts struck at the very core of their urban system. Cities like Mohenjo-daro were built on platforms to withstand seasonal floods, but with no flood and no water at all, these engineering marvels became obsolete. Granaries were no longer filled. Baths no longer served ritual or hygiene. Trade dwindled, and social cohesion began to unravel. Some scholars describe this period as a climate crisis, not an overnight catastrophe, but a long, slow, relentless struggle against environmental decline. A struggle the Harappans met with resilience, but one that ultimately forced them to adapt in new ways, in new places. As the Indus plains grew drier, many Harappans migrated eastward, toward regions where monsoon rains remained more reliable. They carried their traditions, crafts, and agricultural knowledge with them, planting the seeds of future cultures that would emerge centuries later. The story of the Indus Valley's decline is not one of a violent end, but of environmental change on a massive scale, of rivers lost, rains that failed, and a civilization forced to let go of its cities and return to the land. It is a reminder that even the most advanced societies remain at the mercy of nature, and that climate, above all, can be both a creator and a destroyer of civilizations. As the environment of the Indus Valley grew harsher and rivers began to vanish, the economic systems that had once sustained this vast civilization began to falter. Central to the prosperity of the Harappan world was trade, both local and long distance. Archaeological discoveries show that the Indus people maintained active commercial networks, trading goods such as lapis lazuli, carnelian beads, cotton textiles, ivory, and metal tools across large distances. Their trade extended as far west as Mesopotamia, where the Harappans were known as the people of Meluha, a land described in Sumerian records as a source of exotic and valuable goods. Indus seals have been found in cities like Ur and Lagash, and Mesopotamian-style artifacts have been uncovered in Harappan sites, pointing to a vibrant exchange of commodities and ideas. But this far-reaching trade network was not immune to disruption. Around the same time that climate change and river shifts were destabilizing the Indus region, Mesopotamia itself was entering a period of political instability and economic strain. Empires rose and fell, cities were attacked or abandoned, and trade routes across the Persian Gulf and overland corridors through Iran became increasingly unreliable. As Mesopotamian demand for Harappan goods declined, so too did the volume of exports from the Indus cities. The ports and inland trade hubs that had once buzzed with activity, places like Lothal and Sutkagendor, began to fall silent. The economic consequences were profound. Without robust trade, the Harappans began to move away from their massive urban centers and settle in smaller, more rural communities. Archaeological records from the so-called late Harappan period show these smaller settlements spreading eastward, especially toward the upper Ganges basin, where water was still relatively abundant. In these new regions, the people maintained many aspects of their culture: pottery styles, farming techniques, tool-making practices, but they adapted to a more localized agrarian lifestyle. The grand cityscape gave way to scattered villages. Large-scale administration and trade diminished, replaced by simpler, self-sustaining economies. The highly centralized planning that once defined the Harappan world slowly gave way to regional diversity. The decline of uniformity is one of the most telling signs of this transformation. During the peak of the civilization, cities shared common layouts, artifacts were standardized, and construction followed strict ratios. But in the later stages, we begin to see fragmentation, distinct local pottery types, regional variations in weights and measures, and differences in burial practices. This suggests that as the centralized systems of governance and coordination faded, smaller communities began developing their own cultural identities. Rather than being governed by a single authority or elite class, the Harappan world may have become more decentralized, with power diffused across many smaller autonomous groups. This social shift was likely a pragmatic response to the challenges of the time. With climate instability, shrinking water sources, and a collapse in long-distance trade, maintaining vast urban centers would have become increasingly difficult. Smaller, flexible rural communities were better suited to surviving in a changing environment. Far from being passive victims of decline, the Harappan people appear to have actively adapted to their circumstances. They reorganized their way of life, preserving aspects of their culture while letting go of those no longer sustainable. In this way, the end of the Indus Valley Civilization was not a dramatic fall, but a complex transformation. It was a shift in scale, in structure, and in strategy. The cities may have faded, but the people endured, resilient, adaptive, and evolving into the next chapters of South Asian history. Their legacy did not vanish. It quietly continued in new forms, carried forward by the very people who once walked the streets of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the dominant explanation for the decline of the Indus Valley Civilization was the so-called Aryan invasion theory. This theory, proposed during the colonial era, suggested that Indo-European-speaking Aryans, nomadic pastoralists from Central Asia, invaded the Indian subcontinent around 1500 BCE, bringing with them their language, culture, and religion. According to this narrative, these newcomers overpowered the native Harappan people, destroyed their cities, and replaced their civilization. It was an idea heavily shaped by colonial attitudes, depicting the Aryans as superior conquerors and framing South Asian history as a product of outside intervention. But over time, archaeological evidence has strongly challenged and ultimately discredited this theory. Excavations at Harappan sites have revealed no signs of widespread violence or destruction that would be expected from a violent invasion. There are no mass graves, no scorched city layers, and no dramatic cultural break. Instead, the archaeological record shows a gradual, peaceful transformation, suggesting that the decline was due to environmental and economic pressures, not military conquest. Moreover, linguistic and genetic studies have complicated the picture. While Indo-Aryan languages did eventually spread across northern India, this appears to have been a slower process of migration, assimilation, and cultural exchange, not a sudden overthrow of one civilization by another. Many scholars today believe that the Vedic culture associated with the Aryans evolved in parallel with, or perhaps even absorbed, remnants of the Harappan world. In light of this, the Aryan invasion theory has been replaced by more nuanced models of migration, interaction, and continuity. Rather than a tale of conquest and collapse, the real story of the Indus Valley's end is one of environmental adaptation, cultural resilience, and transformation over time. Although the great cities of the Indus Valley Civilization were eventually abandoned, its cultural legacy did not vanish. Instead, many elements of Harappan life quietly persisted, evolving over time and blending into the rural traditions of the Indian subcontinent. Archaeological evidence from the late Harappan period reveals clear signs of continuity. Pottery styles, agricultural tools, craft techniques, and even architectural elements from the urban phase continued to appear in post-urban village settlements. Practices such as brick-making, bead production, and irrigation techniques survived and were adapted to smaller, more localized contexts. In religious and symbolic life, too, there are hints of endurance. Many seals from the Indus period depict sacred animals like bulls and elephants, figures seated in meditative postures, and motifs resembling fertility symbols, all of which appear again in modified forms in later South Asian religious traditions. Some scholars suggest that elements of Harappan spirituality may have filtered into early Vedic rituals and later into Hinduism, though direct links remain speculative. In terms of settlement patterns, many communities migrated eastward toward the Ganges Plain, where they continued to farm, build, and worship in ways that reflected their Harappan heritage. The shift from large cities to smaller villages was not the end of a civilization, but its transformation into a more dispersed, rural way of life. Rather than a complete collapse, the Indus Valley Civilization underwent a cultural reorganization, its influence embedded in the daily lives of the people who followed. This quiet continuity reminds us that civilizations don't always disappear with a crash. Sometimes they dissolve into the fabric of the future, shaping it from within. The Harappan legacy lives on, not just in ruins and relics, but in the enduring rhythms of South Asian life. Despite over a century of excavation and study, the Indus Valley Civilization remains one of the most enigmatic cultures of the ancient world. Perhaps the greatest mystery is its writing system. Thousands of short inscriptions have been found on seals, tablets, and pottery, engraved with symbols that appear to form a script. But because we have no bilingual texts, like the Rosetta Stone, the script remains undeciphered. Without access to their written records, we still don't know how the Harappans thought, what they believed, or how they governed their cities. Questions also remain about their religion. Did they worship deities? Was there a priestly class? Were the iconic figures on the seals gods, ancestors, or symbols of nature? We also don't fully understand their social structure. The apparent lack of royal palaces, monumental temples, or military artifacts makes the Harappan world feel radically different from its contemporaries. And yet the mechanisms of power and organization must have existed in some form. Equally puzzling is how such a vast and complex society functioned with no obvious signs of centralized rule. Who planned these cities? Who enforced the remarkable uniformity in brick size, street layouts, and weights and measures across a civilization spread over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers? And finally, while we've made major strides in understanding the environmental factors behind the civilization's decline, we still lack clarity on how different regions were affected and how people adapted in real time. Every new excavation, every seal or skeleton uncovered adds a piece to the puzzle, but many pieces are still missing. The Indus Valley Civilization continues to challenge our assumptions and invite our curiosity. Its silence speaks volumes, urging us to listen more carefully to the echoes of a world not yet fully understood. The Indus Valley Civilization stands as one of humanity's earliest great experiments in urban life. It thrived for centuries with remarkable planning, technological innovation, and cultural coherence, yet without kings, conquests, or empires as we know them. Its cities were clean, organized, and advanced in ways that still impress modern engineers. Its people created a society based on balance between city and nature, trade and craft, ritual and routine. Even though their writing remains unread and many of their beliefs are lost to time, the legacy of the Harappans endures in the DNA of people across South Asia, in the agricultural rhythms of rural communities, and in the enduring mystery of how a civilization can flourish through cooperation rather than domination. The story of the Indus Valley is not one of sudden collapse, but of adaptation, resilience, and quiet transformation. As climates changed and rivers dried, its people didn't vanish. They moved, evolved, and carried their knowledge with them. What remains today are not just ruins, but reminders of human ingenuity and the fragile relationship between civilization and nature. And perhaps most importantly, the Indus Valley invites us to rethink what it means for a civilization to succeed. Its silence, free of kings' proclamations or war monuments, speaks of a different path in human history, one where power may have been decentralized, where cities were designed with civic life in mind, and where peace, not war, was the foundation of a flourishing world. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.